Deep inside the mountain, the flashlight was held low against the wet stone, casting only a faint circle of light, because the man holding it understood that someone who had spent days in darkness could not bear a bright beam. Rafe Castellani knelt down, his backpack still strapped to his shoulders, his coat caked with mud and rain. In front of him, a young woman leaned against the rock wall, one leg pinned beneath a collapsed slab, her lips cracked, her hair matted in damp strands. He unscrewed the cap of a water bottle and held it out, keeping just enough distance that reaching for it would be her decision, not his. Small sips only. Josie Callahan looked at him for a long time, longer than a thirsty person should look at a bottle of water. Then she reached out, took one swallow, and whispered something that made the man who could silence all of South Philadelphia close his eyes for a second. So someone did keep looking. He did not answer right away. Outside, rain was still falling across the Poconos, and no one in the city knew that either of them was here. 7 days earlier, Josie Callahan had disappeared from the mansion where she worked as a housemaid. 7 days earlier, someone had found an opened safe, a missing necklace, and a story so tidy that no one bothered to ask a single further question. The police closed the file after 4 days. The whole city agreed that the housemaid had stolen and run. Only one man refused to sign his name to that agreement, and, of all people, it was the one man in that city no one dared look straight in the eye. Before this story goes any further, I would love to know something about you. How old are you? And where are you listening from? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everyone around you believed it was time for you to let go? If this story touched you, leave a like, so I know you are still here with me. Share it with someone you believe would never give up on you. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can meet again in the next story. 7 days before that rainy night, Josie Callahan finished her shift at 9 o'clock in the evening. She took off her apron, folded it into quarters, put it away in her employee locker, then walked out through the rear gate of the mansion just as she did every other night. Getting from South Philadelphia to the parish shelter took 3 bus rides. The first bus was crowded, the second was always 15 minutes late, and by the time she boarded the third, she was usually the only person left sitting in the back row. She had traveled that route for so long that she didn't need to look at the electronic display to know how many stops remained before she had to get off. The shoes on her feet had worn smooth along the outer soles, their toes faded and scuffed, and she still tied the laces in 2 tight loops, a habit left over from her school days, pulling them snug so she wouldn't have to bend down and retie them in the middle of a shift. Odessa Pruitt had once told her she ought to buy a new pair. Josie had laughed and said if the shoes could still be worn, what was the point of buying new ones? Bertie was sitting on the steps waiting when Josie arrived, both arms wrapped around her knees, her feet swinging gently. 9 years old, smaller than most children her age, and always sitting on the 3rd step from the bottom, because from there she could see all the way to the end of the street. You're 10 minutes late. The bus was late, not me. You always blame the bus. Josie sat down beside her and pulled a notebook from her bag, wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve. She opened it, turned to a page ruled with small lines in blue ink, and held it out for Bertie to see. What time did you take it this morning? 7 o'clock. And this afternoon? 4 o'clock. Sister Ruthie already wrote it down. Why do you have to ask again? Because Sister Ruthie writes it down for herself, and I write it down for me. Josie marked 2 small boxes, closed the notebook, slipped it back into the plastic sleeve, and tucked it into the pocket of her coat. That notebook had been with her for 2 years, through season after season of rain. One corner of the sleeve had torn, but she still hadn't replaced it. Inside were Bertie's medication schedule, her appointment dates, her doctor's phone number, and on the last few pages, the figures Josie added and added again every month. What did the doctor say on Tuesday? Bertie shrugged. Same thing as last time, said to wait. Waiting means there's still time. Waiting means we still don't have enough money. Josie was quiet for a moment. The girl was only 9 years old, yet she already knew how to put her finger directly on the heart of a problem, and Josie didn't know whether she should feel proud of her or ache for her. The total cost of the heart surgery, even after everything the insurance covered and everything the parish could contribute, still left a remaining amount that would take someone earning a maid's wages nearly 3 more years to save. Josie had done the math over and over again. She had tried cutting back on bus fare by walking one stretch of the route. She had tried taking extra weekend shifts, but the final number still refused to become any smaller. You quit nursing school because of me, didn't you? Josie turned to look at her. Who told you that? Nobody. I figured it out myself. That year I was in the hospital, and then all of a sudden you stopped going to school. I already finished 2 years. I didn't quit, I just put it on hold. It's been 6 years. You still call that putting it on hold? Josie laughed, a short little laugh, then wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. I know how to read the numbers. I know how to check a pulse. I know when it's time to call a doctor. If they don't want to give me a degree, fine. Nobody can take those things away from me. The chapel bell rang 10 o'clock. The sister on duty stood in the doorway, looking out, and tapped twice against the doorframe. Bertie got to her feet and brushed her hands against the legs of her pants. You'll call tonight, right? I'll call. What time? Same as always. You've never forgotten, have you? Josie stood as well and straightened the collar around Bertie's neck. Never. And I won't. Bertie had climbed 2 steps when she turned around again and asked a question she'd been carrying in her mind all evening. Josie, are you afraid of the boss? Josie hesitated for half a heartbeat. In that mansion, people didn't say the boss's name unless they had to. Delivery men lowered their voices when they came to the gate. The plumber finished his work and left immediately, without even accepting a glass of water. But Josie thought of the man who sat at the head of the dining table, a man of few words who never raised his voice, and she realized that wasn't where her fear lived. No. Really? I'm only afraid of next month. Bertie nodded as though she understood, even though she almost certainly didn't understand all of it, then ran inside. Josie remained on the steps for a little while longer, listening to the sound of the door closing behind her, before turning back toward the bus stop. She didn't know that only 6 more nights remained before that phone call would stop coming, and the first person to notice the silence would be a 9-year-old girl sitting on the 3rd step. The following evening, the mansion had been glowing with lights since 6 o'clock. Odessa Pruitt rearranged the shifts, assigning Josie to the main drawing room instead of the 2nd floor where she usually worked, and before the guests arrived, she gave her only one instruction. Stay around the outside of the room. Don't stand near the center table. Josie understood what she meant. The center table belonged to the kind of men whose names were known throughout the entire city but were never spoken beyond those 4 walls. She carried trays, moved around the perimeter, kept her distance, and for the first 2 hours, everything passed much like any other evening. Then, at around 9:30, one of the guests rose from the center table, braced a hand against the edge of his chair, and knocked a glass of wine onto the carpet. He wasn't from Philadelphia. Josie had overheard that he'd come up from Baltimore with a business proposal that still hadn't received an answer, and perhaps that was why he'd spent the entire evening speaking louder than everyone else in the room combined. She stepped forward, set down her tray, and took out a cloth to blot the spill. The guest looked down at her, pulled several bills from the inside pocket of his jacket, dropped them onto the floor beside the pool of wine, then spoke in a voice just loud enough for the neighboring table to hear. Pick those up too. Consider it your tip. The entire room went silent. It wasn't the silence of people caught by surprise. It was the silence of people who had learned long ago to remain perfectly still when something happened directly in front of them. Jerry Mancuso sat at the head of the table, slowly turning his water glass between his fingers, and he didn't look at Josie even once. His eyes lifted instead toward the top of the staircase. Josie didn't look up. She blotted every drop of wine she could, turned the cloth over, wiped the carpet a second time, until the red stain that had seeped into the fibers was gone, then folded the cloth and placed it back on the tray. The bills remained exactly where they'd fallen. She straightened, both hands gripping the edges of the tray, and spoke softly, but clearly enough to be heard. I'll clean your floor for you. I won't pick up your money. Someone at a table behind her set down a glass a little too hard. The guest blinked twice, as though he'd misheard her. He opened his mouth to say something else when footsteps sounded from the top of the staircase. Rafe Castellani came down slowly, one hand still tucked into his trouser pocket. He didn't look at Josie. He didn't look at the money lying on the floor. He stopped about 2 steps away from the guest and said only one sentence, in an ordinary voice no louder than the one he used when asking what time it was. In my house, people who work are paid a wage. They aren't paid like that. Then he fell silent. He didn't add anything. He didn't explain. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there and waited. And it was that silence more than anything else that made the guest begin to understand. No one else in the room spoke. The guest gave a short laugh, trying to hold on to the last scraps of his dignity, muttered something about how late it was getting, then bent down, picked up his own money, and put it back in his pocket. 10 minutes later, his car was already beyond the gates. No one walked him out. The business proposal from Baltimore was never mentioned again. Josie carried the tray down to the kitchen. She rinsed the cloth beneath cold running water, wrung it out, then hung it on the rack. And only then did she realize that her hands were still trembling slightly. Not because she was afraid, but because when she'd spoken those words, she hadn't given herself enough time to think first. Odessa came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway watching her for a long moment. "Do you know who that man was?" "No. Lucky for you." She didn't scold Josie, and she didn't praise her. She simply took a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water, set it beside Josie's hand, and walked out. Half an hour later, when nearly all the guests had gone, Josie was crossing the hallway when she saw Rafe standing in the doorway of his study. He looked at her. She stopped. Under ordinary circumstances, this was the moment when a person was supposed to say thank you. She'd been about to, but then she thought of what he'd said downstairs, that people who worked were paid a wage, and she understood that if she thanked him, she would be turning what he'd done into a favor. So she only gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible, and continued walking. Rafe didn't stop her. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't say he'd done it for her. He didn't say anything at all. He simply stood there watching until she turned the corner at the end of the hallway. Down in the drawing room, Jerry Mancuso was still sitting exactly where he'd been all evening, the water in his glass barely touched. Not once that entire night had he looked directly at the maid. He remembered only one thing, that there was someone who had made Rafael Castellani leave the top of the staircase and come down. And in the 9 years Jerry had sat beside that man, he'd never seen it happen before. 3 days after the party, Odessa assigned Josie to clean the study on the first floor. It was the only room in the house that received a thorough cleaning just once a month, and it always had to be done in the morning when no one was inside. Josie opened the windows, vacuumed the carpet, wiped down the desk, and dusted the picture frames on the mantel. One of them held a small portrait of a very young woman with dark hair, leaning against the door of a car and smiling at whoever was holding the camera. Josie had cleaned that photograph many times and had never once asked anyone who she was. When she reached the filing cabinet in the corner, she pulled it about a hand's width away from the wall so she could vacuum the dust gathered behind it. A piece of paper lay against the baseboard, folded in half, one edge torn unevenly. She picked it up, intending to toss it into the trash bag with the other scraps of paper. But when she opened it, she saw that it wasn't trash. It was a page torn from a notebook, and she recognized the paper immediately. Thick paper yellowing around the edges, faintly ruled with squares. The same kind of paper that had been inside the brown leather-bound notebook she'd pushed aside on the kitchen table that night. The upper half of the page contained a column of numbers, one number on each line, some with a line drawn beside them, others marked with a dot of ink. She didn't understand what they meant. She didn't keep books, didn't read reports, and all her life she'd dealt with numbers far smaller than these. But she'd spent enough nights adding and subtracting figures to recognize one simple thing. People only wrote numbers down by hand like this when they didn't want them in a computer. Beneath the column was a handwritten line in slanted blue-black ink, the careful, old-fashioned penmanship of an older person. Josie read it twice, and still didn't understand it, because it wasn't a complete sentence. Only a few scattered words written down as though the writer had meant to remind himself of something. And at the bottom of the page, separated from everything else and written smaller than the rest, was a name. Nadia. Beside the name was a date. Josie counted backward in her head. 9 years ago. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the study, holding the page in her hand, and the first thing she thought about wasn't the name. The first thing she thought about was what Rafe had told her in the kitchen that night. To leave the notebook exactly where she'd moved it and not put it away anywhere. By the next morning, the notebook had disappeared from the table, and now, in her hand, was a page torn from that same notebook, lying behind a filing cabinet, in a place where an ordinary fallen sheet of paper couldn't possibly have landed. Josie didn't know who Nadia was. She didn't know what the numbers meant either, but she'd worked in this house for 1 year and 7 months, and she understood one rule no one ever needed to teach her. Anything torn out and hidden inside this mansion was something best left untouched. She was about to fold the page and put it back behind the cabinet. She had already bent down. Then she stopped, because she remembered who had left the notebook on the kitchen table that night. And she remembered that throughout the entire party, that man had been the only person in the room who hadn't looked at her even once. She straightened, took the notebook wrapped in plastic from her coat pocket, opened it to the page with Bertie's medication schedule, slipped the torn sheet between the pages, closed the notebook, slid it back into the plastic sleeve, and returned it to her pocket. She did it quickly and neatly, like someone putting away a receipt. The study door opened. Jerry Mancuso stood in the doorway with one hand still on the knob. He didn't come inside. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't say anything at all. He simply looked at her hand, looked at the pocket of her coat, then raised his eyes to her face. And his expression was still as gentle as it always was whenever he passed her in the hallway. "Are you finished in here, Josie?" "Almost, sir." "Take your time. This room gets dusty." He nodded, smiled, then pulled the door closed and walked away. Josie remained standing in the middle of the room for a long while. Beyond the door, she heard his footsteps travel the length of the hallway, descend the stairs, then disappear completely. She pushed the filing cabinet back into place, wound up the vacuum cord, closed the windows, and finished everything else in the room exactly as she always did. Only after she stepped out did she realize she'd been gripping the edge of her coat tightly in one hand the entire time. The next day, Jerry Mancuso waited for her in the first-floor hallway, at the bend where a window looked out over the back courtyard. He didn't block her path. He'd been standing there already, both hands clasped behind his back, gazing outside, and when she approached, he turned as though he'd only just happened to remember something. "Josie, do you have 2 minutes?" "Yes, sir. Stand here with me for a little while. I get tired of standing by myself." He asked about her first. He asked which bus route she took to work, whether the buses were crowded this time of year, mentioned that a cousin of his used to ride the same route years ago, then told her a short story about the woman, and laughed to himself. Josie stood there and listened. He was the only person in the house who always called her by her first name instead of by her position. And in 1 year and 7 months, he'd never once spoken an unkind word to her. "You have a younger sister, don't you?" "Yes, at the parish place on 8th Street. The little girl has a heart condition." Josie went silent. She'd never told anyone in the house about Bertie except Odessa. "Don't be uncomfortable," I asked, because I know someone on the hospital board. I had a look at the file. He said the amount without emphasizing it, without watching her face for a reaction, almost as though he were reading the price of something from a catalog. It was exactly the number she'd been adding and adding again for the past 2 years, the number she knew down to the very last digit. "I can take care of that. Everything. The surgery, the recovery stay, the medication for the first year. I can have it handled within a week." Josie said nothing. Outside the window, a gardener was dragging a hose across the courtyard. "And what do you want in return? You quit your job here, and you take the girl out of Philadelphia before the end of the week. Go anywhere you want, wherever is best for her. I know people in Pittsburgh. The children's heart surgery there is even better than what you have here." "Why?" "Because you're still young, and this house isn't a place for young people." He said it so gently that for 1 second Josie almost believed he truly cared about her. Maybe he did care. That was what made it difficult. You could spend another 10 years cleaning floors here and you'd still be cleaning floors. But that little girl can't wait 10 years. "I've worked in this house for 40 years, Josie. I've seen a lot of good people walk through that gate out there. Not everyone who walks in comes back out the same way they went in." Josie looked down into the courtyard. She thought of Bertie sitting on the 3rd step, her legs swinging, telling her she'd been 10 minutes late. She thought of the column of numbers at the back of her notebook, the figures she erased and rewrote every month, and how each time they moved only a little. If Jerry handed her that envelope today, then tomorrow night she could sit on those steps and tell her sister they didn't have to wait anymore. Then she thought of something else. She thought about how he knew the hospital's name, knew the amount, even knew the street where Bertie lived. Yet in 1 year and 7 months, he'd never once asked Josie a single question about any of it. He'd only asked today. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Think about it first." "I already have. I can't take it." Jerry turned fully toward her. He didn't look surprised. "Can you tell me why?" "I'm not good with words, so I'll say it simply. My mother once accepted money from someone too. It was this easy, and that person was just as kind as you are. When she took it, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it. It was only much later that we saw what came with it. I'm not afraid of your money, but I'm afraid of the part I can't see yet." "You think I'm hiding something from you?" "I'm not thinking anything, sir. I only know that money that comes too easily always has a price. and people usually don't see that price until after all the money has already been spent. Jerry was quiet for a long while. Then he smiled, and there was nothing false in that smile. That little girl of yours is very fortunate. He tapped the stair rail lightly twice, then walked away. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, he went into Rafe's study, placed a file concerning the contract for Pier 7 on the desk, and said the people in New York were demanding an in-person meeting, urgently, and that it would only take 2 nights. Rafe left Philadelphia on Thursday morning. By Friday evening, just as Josie was hanging her apron on its hook, Trey Lindquist was waiting for her by the back door, turning a set of car keys around one finger. The boss said I'm supposed to take you to see your sister tonight. He said 3 bus rides are too much for you. Josie hesitated. He's in New York. He called back. Are you coming or not? Let me know. I still have to get home. She thought about standing at the stop, waiting for the second bus in the cold wind. And she thought about Bertie sitting on the 3rd step. She took her coat, checked the pocket, and the notebook wrapped in plastic was still there. When they reached the gate, Trey held out his hand. Your access card. Why? At night, when a car takes staff out through the gate, the card has to be clipped into the guard log. I'll give it back when the paperwork is done. She handed it over. He slipped the card into his breast pocket without writing anything in any logbook, and Josie wouldn't understand the importance of that detail until much later. The car pulled away. For the first 20 minutes they followed the right route, past the familiar intersection, past the gas station she usually walked by. Then, when they reached the place where he should have turned left onto 8th Street, the car continued straight ahead. You missed the turn. Trey didn't answer. The car reached the highway and left the city behind. The lights grew farther apart until there was nothing on either side except darkened signs and access roads leading into industrial areas. Half an hour later, the road began to climb, and a steep rock face appeared on the right. Where are we? He still said nothing. Josie looked into the rearview mirror and caught his eyes there. And what sent the coldest chill down her spine wasn't anger in his expression, but the fact that her question didn't seem to bother him at all. He drove like a man finishing a task he'd been given, something he intended to complete before going home. She reached for the door handle and tried it. Locked. Let me out. Sit still. Josie did sit still, and while she sat there, she counted. She counted the curves. She noticed that every time they reached a sharp bend, the car slowed almost to a crawl because the pavement was wet. And she remembered that the door locks in her old home had been the same kind, the kind that could be controlled from the driver's seat unless the passenger in back manually pulled the lock pin up. She thought of Jerry standing in the hallway the day before, thought of what he'd said about how not everyone who walked through that gate came back out the same way they went in, and now she understood that he hadn't been threatening her. He'd only been telling her something he knew for certain. He didn't need her silence. He only needed her far enough away that no one would ever ask another question. Rain began to fall, the first drops tapping against the windshield. The car entered a sharp bend, the headlights sweeping across the rock face, and the speed dropped. Josie pulled the lock pin up, shoved the door open, and threw herself out. She hit the wet grass along the roadside, rolled twice down into the drainage ditch, then scrambled to her feet and ran. Behind her came the long scream of brakes across wet pavement, the slam of a car door, then someone calling her name once, not very loudly, the way a person calls when trying to determine whether someone is still close by. She didn't look back. She ran straight into the pine woods on the left side of the road, toward the darkest place she could see, and only after she'd gone about 20 steps did she realize that her left foot was striking the cold ground bare. Her shoe had come off somewhere behind her. She didn't stop to look for it. A flashlight beam swept across the tree trunks behind her once, then again, then drifted farther to the right, because whoever held the light had guessed the wrong direction. Josie pressed herself flat behind the trunk of a pine tree, her face against the layer of rotting leaves, and stayed completely still for a very long time, longer than she needed to, until the sound of footsteps on gravel disappeared entirely. The rain grew heavier. Out on the road, she heard another car door close, the engine start, then tires grinding over gravel as the vehicle turned around. The dashboard clock showed 1:40 in the morning. The car headed back toward Philadelphia, its red taillights blurring in the rain before disappearing around the curve. No one remained inside except the driver. On the floor beneath the back seat lay one old shoe, tilted onto its side, its sole worn thin, its laces tied in 2 loops. Trey Lindquist glanced down at it once through the rearview mirror, then kept driving, and he didn't touch that shoe once during the entire trip back. Rafe returned to the mansion on Saturday afternoon, and everything had already been laid out waiting for him on the desk in his study. A printed copy of the gate log showing that Josie Callahan's access card had been swiped sometime after midnight. Photographs of the safe door in the second-floor bedroom. An inventory listing what remained inside and what was missing. He read through all of it without asking a single question, then pushed the papers aside. Jerry stood on the other side of the desk, holding his reading glasses in one hand without putting them on. "I've spoken to everyone in the house. No one heard anything. What do you think?" "I don't want to think. But I've worked here for 40 years, Raphael. The kindest person in the house is always the one who takes the most. Not because they're greedy. Because they're the only one allowed into places everyone else is forbidden to enter." Rafe didn't answer. Over the next 2 days, everyone in the mansion believed it. They believed it the way people always believed neat stories, without arguing, without asking questions, simply lowering their voices whenever they mentioned her name, and quickly moving on to something else. Someone said she was too gentle by nature, so perhaps somebody had put the idea in her head. Someone else said her little sister was sick, and desperation could drive a person to do something reckless. Every theory was compassionate in its own way, and every theory led back to the same conclusion. On the 4th day, Deputy Sheriff Hollis Bream came to return the file. He stood in the parking area outside the gate and didn't enter the house, the folder tucked beneath one arm. "We checked the bus stations, the train stations, and both airports. Her name isn't on any passenger list. Her phone has been off since that night. There's no indication she was forced to go anywhere. No one has reported seeing anything unusual. So what's your conclusion?" "Voluntary disappearance with possible theft involved. Procedurally, we'll keep the case open. But to be frank with you, we don't have anything else to pursue. We've done everything reasonable, Mr. Castellani." Rafe looked at him for a moment. "You've done everything easy." Bream blinked. He looked as though he might say something more, then decided against it, gave a small nod, got into his car, and drove away. Rafe remained alone in the parking area. Night had already fallen. The gate lamps had come on, and he stood there until the sound of the police car disappeared completely at the end of the street. He wasn't thinking about the necklace. He was thinking about one very small detail, something no one in the house had mentioned over the past several days. That if someone had decided to steal something and disappear in the middle of the night, why would that person hand her access card to the driver at the gate, instead of swiping it herself and simply walking out? He hadn't yet reached the next question when Odessa Pruitt appeared on the steps behind him. He didn't know how long she'd been standing there. "Come inside. It's cold out here." She waited until he entered the kitchen, then placed an envelope on the long table. It was white, its edges slightly curled from having sat untouched for some time, with a handwritten name in one corner. It was still sealed, unopened, the flap still firmly stuck down. "What's this?" "The girl's wages from last month. Every month I put each person's pay envelope in their employee locker. She never took hers. I found it yesterday when I cleaned out the locker." Rafe picked it up. Light. He turned it over. The envelope was still sealed. Maybe she forgot. She didn't forget. Odessa pulled out a chair and sat down, resting both hands on the table, then continued in the calm voice of someone who had spent an entire night thinking carefully before speaking. "That girl took 3 buses to get to work. Every month, as soon as she was paid, she went straight to the bank that same afternoon. I know because she always had to ask me to switch her shift. She counted money down to the last cent, Rafe. She wore a pair of shoes until the soles were so worn I told her to buy new ones, and she still wouldn't. With a girl like that, I can't argue with anyone. I don't have proof of anything." She pushed the envelope a little farther toward him. "But a thief doesn't forget her own money." Rafe said nothing. He held the envelope in his hand for a very long time, and there in that kitchen, at the same long table where 11 nights earlier someone had placed a bowl of soup in front of him and sat 3 seats away, he realized that for the past 4 days, he'd allowed a story to be told to him, and he'd sat there listening just like everyone else. He'd heard that question once before, 9 years earlier, in a parking lot in the Poconos. Nadia had been 16 then, spending the weekend there with 2 friends, and she never made it back to the car on Sunday afternoon. People searched for 3 straight days. On the morning of the 4th day, the search commander spread a map across the hood of a vehicle and told Rafe that a storm was moving in, that he couldn't keep hundreds of volunteers out on the wet mountainside, and that they'd already covered every area a lost person could reasonably have reached. He said all of it in the voice of a man who was genuinely sorry, and everything he said was true. Rafe was 25 then. He stood there listening, nodded, thanked him, then packed his things into the trunk. On the drive home, he kept reminding himself that people who did this for a living knew when enough was enough, that staying behind alone in a storm would only create one more person who needed to be found, that he'd done everything reasonable. He believed that for 10 days. 10 days later, they found her. The place where she was found lay less than 1.25 miles beyond the boundary of the search map. He'd never told anyone that story. He'd also never spoken aloud the thing he knew better than anyone else, that the man he'd become, the way he sat motionless in the dark at 3 o'clock in the morning, the way he never trusted a story simply because it was neat and complete, all of it had been shaped by that exact distance of less than about 1.25 miles. He turned on the hallway light. The portrait was still hanging in the same place between 2 bedroom doors. A very young, dark-haired girl leaning against the door of a car. He stood in front of it longer than he usually did, and only then did he remember something Odessa had mentioned in passing a few months earlier, that the new girl had once asked her who the woman in the photograph was, and Odessa had told her she was the boss's younger sister, that she'd died, and that she shouldn't ask about it again. He couldn't remember whether he'd really listened when Odessa told him, but now he was certain of one thing, that in this entire house, Josie Callahan was the only person who had ever stopped in front of that photograph long enough to ask a question. He went down to the kitchen close to 4 o'clock in the morning. He didn't turn on the light. He sat in the same place as before, and this time no one carried out a bowl of soup for him. No one pulled out a chair 3 seats away and told him that people only trembled in front of someone they owed. The only thing on the table was the unopened pay envelope. He thought about the previous 4 days. He'd read a file prepared by someone else, listened to an account told by someone else, and stood still while a deputy sheriff told him they'd done everything reasonable. He'd sat in the middle of his own house and allowed the story to be carried directly into his hands, just as he had 9 years earlier. The next morning, he got up at 6 o'clock. He didn't call anyone. He didn't say a word to Jerry, not because he'd already begun to suspect him, but because he no longer knew who in that house belonged to whom. And once he no longer knew, the only safe thing was to tell no one anything. He went down to the garage, walked past the 3 household cars, and stopped beside the old pickup truck parked in the corner, the truck his grandfather had left behind, the only thing in that garage no one had touched in years. He opened the bed. Everything the old man had packed there long ago was still inside, and Rafe replaced the batteries, checked every item, then packed them into a backpack. A compass, a flashlight, a first aid kit, 2 bottles of water, a coil of rope, a metal whistle clipped to one of the straps. Enough food for 1 day, no more. Odessa was standing in the garage doorway when he closed the truck bed. She didn't ask where he was going. She asked only one question. "How many days will you be gone?" "I don't know." She nodded, then turned and went back inside. Rafe got into the truck, and for the first time in 9 years, he drove out through the gate heading north. But he didn't drive straight into the mountains. He went to Pier 7 first, to the headquarters of the Port Transportation Company, the only asset in his name that Jerry had never touched, because it was the clean side of the business. Nothing but trucks, invoices, and payroll. Every vehicle in the company fleet was fitted with an automatic toll transponder, and the private cars used by people from the house were tied to the same account, because 4 years earlier Rafe himself had approved combining them to keep the bookkeeping simple. He went into the accounting office, sat down at a computer, and searched the records himself. He didn't ask anyone to do it for him. Over the past 4 days, he'd learned one thing, that whenever information passed through someone else's hands before reaching his, it always arrived already arranged into a shape someone had chosen. He filtered by Trey Lindquist's license plate, then by Friday night. The record appeared clean and simple. The car passed through the toll station north of the city at 12:50 after midnight, continued onto the mountain route, then came back through that same toll station at 2:59 in the morning. Rafe sat staring at those 2 lines for a long time, 2 hours and 10 minutes. He opened a map and measured the distance. From the toll station heading north, if a car drove through the rain at a reasonable speed and made the round trip in 2 hours and 10 minutes, then the farthest point it could possibly have reached was somewhere within roughly 18.5 miles of the toll station. It couldn't have gone farther than that. But that kind of distance, along a winding mountain road, bordered on both sides by pine forest and sheer rock walls, was still an enormous distance for someone on foot. He printed the record, folded it, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, then went down to the employee parking lot behind the building. Trey's car was parked in the last row. Trey was working a shift at the pier, and spare keys for every vehicle in the fleet hung in the dispatch office cabinet, because that was a rule established by Rafe's own company. Rafe opened the car door. The inside was clean, cleaner than a long-distance vehicle should normally have been. The front floor mats were still damp as though they'd recently been sprayed and washed. The rear seat cover had been replaced, and the sharp smell of cleaning solution still lingered in the air. He found nothing on the seats. He found nothing in the door compartments. Then he bent down and reached beneath the rear seat, into the narrow gap between the seat back and the floor, a place difficult for a vacuum hose to reach and easy for someone in a hurry to overlook. His hand touched leather. He pulled it out. A shoe. A woman's shoe. Small, faded in color, scuffed at the toe. The outer sole worn down unevenly along one side, and the familiar, tightly knotted laces told him everything he needed to know before he even touched it. The knot still intact, never once loosened. Rafe sat down on the edge of the open car door with the shoe in his hand, and he stayed there for a very long time in the empty parking lot. He thought about what Odessa had said in the kitchen, that the girl had worn her shoes until the soles were so thin Odessa had told her to buy a new pair, and she still wouldn't. He thought about the printed gate log, about the access card that had been swiped sometime after midnight by someone who, at that very moment, had been sitting inside this car. And he thought about something so simple that no one in the house had been willing to say it aloud for the past 4 days. A person could run away without luggage. A person could run away without collecting her wages. But no one ran away leaving one shoe behind in someone else's car. Its knot still tied, wedged into a place it could only have reached if the person wearing it had lost it very quickly and hadn't had the chance to go back for it. He closed the car door, carried the shoe to the old pickup truck, and placed it on the passenger seat. Then he made one call, and only one, to the dispatch office, saying he would be out of the city for a few days, that he didn't need anyone to come with him, and that no one needed to call him back. He didn't tell Jerry. He didn't tell anyone in the house. At 11 o'clock that morning, the old pickup left Philadelphia heading north, passed through the northern toll station at 11:40, and began climbing the mountain road. On the passenger seat, the shoe lay on its side, the laces still tied in 2 loops. Rafe slowed down and began counting every curve, exactly as someone sitting in the back seat had counted every curve on that other night. He stopped the truck at the 19th kilometer marker, at a sharp bend with a wide grassy shoulder and a sheer rock face rising on the right. He had already passed 7 curves before this one and hadn't stopped at any of them, because his grandfather had taught him that you didn't search by getting out of the vehicle everywhere that looked promising. You searched by asking where the vehicle would have been forced to slow down. This curve was the first place along the entire route where a car traveling in the rain would have had to drop to a very low speed. And on the left side of the road there was pine forest, with no guardrail and no deep ditch. He got out, put on his backpack, and started walking. For the first 15 minutes, he didn't search for anything at all. He simply walked along the roadside and looked. That was the first thing his grandfather had taught him during the summer when Rafe was 11 years old, that people new to the woods always stared at the ground looking for objects, looking for a button, a scrap of cloth, a footprint, and because of that, they found nothing. Rain could erase objects in a single night. What rain couldn't erase was pattern. Water always ran toward the lowest ground. Grass always leaned in the direction of the prevailing wind. Moss always grew thicker on the side of rock that received less sunlight. You didn't search for traces left by a person. You searched for the places where the natural pattern had been broken. No one in the world he'd lived in for the past 15 years knew he could do this. In Philadelphia, people knew him as the man who sat at the head of the table and rarely spoke. No one knew that for 3 summers in a row, a boy had been sent up here to stay with an old hunting guide, and that the old man had never taught him how to shoot. He'd only taught him how to sit still and watch. Rafe found the first irregularity, about 30 paces below the curve. A dry creek bed ran parallel to the road, both banks made of gravel mixed with soil, and on the near bank, a section about the size of 2 hands had collapsed. The edge of the break was still sharp, and the exposed earth beneath was darker than the surface soil, which had been washed pale by the rain. The opposite bank was untouched, its edges already rounded, moss beginning to reclaim it. Both banks had been exposed to the same rain. Only one had collapsed recently. He crouched down without touching it and simply looked. Then he studied the stones, lying in the middle of the creek bed. Stream stones always carried a thin layer of moss across their upper surfaces, and on 2 stones in succession, that moss had been scraped away in 2 separate marks, each about half the size of a human foot, the edges still green and fresh, rather than dry and curled. Water hadn't done that. When water stripped moss from a stone, it peeled it away in elongated patches running with the current. It didn't remove it in 2 isolated spots separated by exactly 1 human stride. He took the notebook from his backpack and wrote down 2 lines, including the time. Then he added another line for himself, because his grandfather had taught him that too, that the most dangerous searcher was the one who found one thing and immediately decided it proved he was right. Not evidence yet, only a possibility. He continued in the direction indicated by the 2 scraped patches of moss, angling upward across the slope and into the edge of the pine forest. Beneath the trees, the ground was covered in pine needles, and less rain had reached the earth. He moved slowly, setting each foot down before shifting his weight onto it, careful not to destroy the very thing he was trying to find. Half an hour later, he stopped in front of a patch of mountain grass. It grew in a clearing between 2 pine trunks, reaching nearly to his knees, and the entire patch leaned in one direction with the wind that regularly swept up from the valley below, exactly like every other patch of grass across that mountainside, except for one narrow trail running straight through the middle, about wide enough for a single person, and along that trail the grass leaned the opposite way. He bent down for a closer look. The stalks weren't broken. If a rock had rolled through, the grass would have been crushed and torn, and there would have been gouges in the earth. If an animal had passed, the grass would have parted toward both sides, and there would have been a lower tunnel through it. But these stalks had simply been pressed flat against the ground, and were now struggling to rise again. The kind of flattening left by steady weight, one step following another, by a person walking through. Rafe straightened and looked in the direction the disturbed grass continued, toward the western slope. He tightened the straps of his backpack and kept going. The trail through the grass led him uphill for about 200 paces, before disappearing completely where the soil gave way to gravel. He stopped, and instead of lowering his head to search for the trail again, he did what his grandfather always did whenever he lost a sign. He lifted his eyes and studied the entire mountainside at once, the way a person studies a familiar face. He looked for about a minute before he saw what was wrong. Roughly 40 paces to the west, in the middle of the brush that covered the slope almost evenly, there was a bare patch of earth about half the size of a football field, noticeably lighter than everything around it. He walked toward it. It was a section of ground that had collapsed, exposing the rock underneath, and what made him stop was the color of that rock. Stone exposed to the open air for years turned gray, with patches of lichen spreading across it. This rock was still pale, its edges sharp, without a single spot of lichen anywhere on its surface. It had only recently been exposed. Weeks ago, not years, he walked along the edge of the landslide. At the upper boundary, a row of young shrubs had been flattened, all of them leaning in the same direction, their tops pointing downhill. He crouched and examined their bases. The roots were still anchored in the earth, not torn apart, and near the bottoms of the stems, several young leaves were already twisting themselves back upward toward the light. The shrubs hadn't been uprooted. A whole mass of earth had slid over them, crushed them down, then moved on. They were still alive, and they were trying to stand again. Rafe took off his backpack, sat on a rock, and watched the water. The rain from the night before was still draining away, and everywhere across the mountainside the water was moving exactly as water was supposed to move, straight toward the lowest ground, following channels it had carved into the slope over hundreds of seasons. Everywhere except one stream. The water ran along the edge of the landslide, continued straight for about 10 paces, then turned sharply west at almost a right angle, slipped through a narrow gap between 2 large rocks, and disappeared beneath a layer of loose stone. He sat watching it for a long time. Water didn't suddenly decide to turn sideways. Water turned sideways when something blocked its path, and whatever had blocked it had to be recent, because if it had been there for a long time, the water would have already cut itself a new channel and begun flowing straight downhill again. He opened his backpack and took out his grandfather's topographic map, an old map printed back when the old man still guided people through these mountains, its edges worn soft and covered in pencil marks he'd added himself. Rafe spread it across the rock, used his flashlight to hold down one corner against the wind, then compared it with the land around him. According to the map, There was a trail running exactly through the place where he was sitting. A thin dotted line followed the western slope, curved around the steep ground, then descended into the valley below. It was the only passable route in this entire area. His grandfather had even written 3 words beside it, in pencil. Old trail, easy walking. Rafe raised his head and looked ahead. The trail wasn't there anymore. The place where it should have crossed the slope was now the landslide, the fresh, exposed rock, the young shrubs crushed flat, the stream forced to turn sideways because something new stood in its path. The storm had taken away an entire section of the mountainside and carried it down below. Rafe remained motionless on the rock and allowed every piece in his mind to fit itself together. Someone abandoned on this mountain road in the middle of a rainy night would have run into the woods and wouldn't have been able to return to the highway. That person would have gone downhill. That person would have followed the same instinct anyone would have, searching for the easiest ground, the place that was a little flatter, the place where the trees grew a little farther apart. That person would have found this trail because it had been the only easy route along the entire western slope, and that person would have followed it. Then the trail would have ended without warning at the place where the mountain itself had changed only a few weeks earlier. He thought about the 4 days the police had spent searching. They'd followed the maps. They'd checked the places a lost person could reasonably have reached, and they'd done it properly, methodically, professionally. There was only one thing none of them had considered, and Rafe folded the map very slowly, as the thought formed completely in his mind. No one had searched the wrong place. They had searched the right place for the mountain as it had existed yesterday. He followed the edge of the landslide downward until he reached the place where the stream had been forced sideways and slipped between 2 large rocks. Beyond those rocks stood a wall of pines growing thickly together, trunk against trunk, their branches woven all the way down to the ground. From above, it looked like one solid mass of green with no way through, but the water had passed through there, and water always found its way into whatever opening existed. He bent low and squeezed through, pushing branches aside, moving for about 20 paces through the deep green darkness, before emerging into a clearing on the other side. And right at the edge of that clearing, caught on the branch of a young pine, was a strip of cloth. It was about a handspan long, once white but now stained gray by rain and mud, one end wrapped around the branch and the other hanging loose. Rafe didn't touch it immediately. He stood looking at it, and the first thing he did was judge its height. The pine branch was level with his shoulder. If floodwater had carried the cloth there, it would have been lying on the ground, caught around the base of a tree, or gathered in some low hollow with dead leaves and broken branches, because moving water dragged things downward. It didn't hang them high above the ground. Something at this height could have gotten there only one way. Someone had carried it past. He looked more closely. The edge of the cloth wasn't ragged the way fabric looked when it had been torn apart. It had separated cleanly along a loosened seam, the kind of break that happened when a finished hem was yanked hard once. He had seen this kind of fabric every day inside his own house for 1 year and 7 months, without ever really noticing it until now. The edge of an apron. He carefully removed it from the branch, folded it, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat. Then he looked across the clearing and stopped dead, about 6 paces from the pine branch. On a patch of bare ground where no grass grew, there were 3 stones. Each was about the size of a fist, arranged in an almost straight line, each one separated from the next by nearly the same distance. Rafe knelt beside them without touching any of them. He studied the soil beneath their edges. Every stone had been pressed slightly into the earth, and around each depression was a small ridge of displaced soil, the kind of ridge a naturally rolling stone would never create, because a rolling stone simply came to rest. It didn't press itself downward. Then he examined their upper surfaces. On all 3 stones, the flattest side had been turned upward. Nature could arrange 3 stones in a line. That happened. Nature didn't turn all 3, so their flattest faces pointed toward the sky. He moved backward and sat against the trunk of a pine, and in that moment he understood 2 things at once. The strip of cloth caught at shoulder height, and the 3 stones lying 6 paces away weren't 2 separate clues. They were 2 traces left by the same journey. Someone had made it this far, passed through the wall of pines and left the edge of an apron caught on a branch, then stopped in this clearing, bent down, turned each stone so the flat side faced upward, and arranged them in a line pointing in one direction. People didn't do that while they were still running away. They did it after they'd calmed down, after they'd realized they couldn't keep going, and while they still believed someone would eventually come. Rafe stood. For the past 2 days, he'd been following the things the mountain had left behind. Now he was following something entirely different. He was following the decisions of a human being. The phone in his breast pocket vibrated. He pulled it out. One bar of signal had appeared, and the caller was the same landline number from the other night. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Sir, do you think my sister is still alive?" "I don't know." "Why don't you lie to me?" "Grown-ups usually lie when they want me to feel better." "Because your sister wouldn't lie to you." The other end of the line was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you still up there?" "Because I haven't found a good enough reason to stop looking." He heard the girl draw in a breath as though she were about to say something else. Then wind shrieked through the receiver, and the line went silent. He looked at the screen. The signal bar was gone. He put the phone into the inside pocket of his coat, zipped it closed, and turned back toward the 3 stones to see where they were pointing. He sat down a short distance away from her, left the bottle of water in her hands, and didn't urge her to take another sip. She drank twice more, only a little each time, then screwed the cap back on herself. That small act of tightening the cap told him more than everything he'd seen since entering the cave. "How much can you drink each day?" "Depends on the rain." She tipped her chin toward the crack in the ceiling where the thin gray light came through. "Water runs down that wall. I use the cap from a container I had in my coat pocket to catch it, and when it fills up, I pour it into the bottle. On days when it rains hard, I can collect almost half a bottle. If it doesn't rain, I go without." "Food?" "I had 2 ration bars in my coat pocket, the kind I always keep for my little sister. I divided them across 4 days. They ran out the day before yesterday." She said all of it in an ordinary voice, the voice of someone giving a report about the day's work. Then she reached inside her coat and pulled out a small notebook wrapped in a plastic sleeve. She opened it near the middle. There were 7 lines on the page, each marked with a single stroke, and beside several of them she'd written a few tiny words. "I make 1 mark every day. I do it in the morning when the light comes through the crack. If I don't write it down, after 2 days I start getting confused. And once I get confused, I'll start thinking I've been in here for a month." Rafe looked at those 7 blue ink marks longer than he'd meant to. "Today is the 7th day." "Yes." He raised the flashlight, kept the beam low, and aimed it toward her feet. Then he stopped. A mass of rock had fallen from the wall on the right, large stones and smaller ones piled against each other, and her left leg was trapped beneath the edge of the lowest boulder. "What day did this happen?" "The 2nd day," she continued briefly, as though she wanted to get the explanation over with. "I sheltered outside the first night. The next morning I came in here, because it was drier. Around noon I managed to find my way back to the cave entrance and made it outside. But the slope outside was almost vertical, and the rain was coming down hard. I knew I couldn't climb back to the main road anymore, so I turned 3 stones flat side up and arranged them in a line pointing toward the cave entrance, in case someone came through. Then I came back inside to shelter again. Just as I came back in, this section collapsed. Rafe didn't say anything. He stood, took the flashlight, and slowly walked all the way around the rockfall, studying it from below, from the side, and from behind. He didn't put his hands on a single stone. His grandfather had taken him across mountainsides like these for 3 summers, and the old man had only needed to tell him one thing about fallen rock, that a pile of stones sitting still didn't mean it was light. It stayed still because the rocks were bearing one another's weight, and the stone that looked easiest to pull free was usually the one carrying the greatest load. Rafe examined 3 contact points and saw that the uppermost boulder was resting on only 2 supports, and both of those supports were on the middle stone. "Can you still feel your foot?" "Not since the 4th day." He switched off the flashlight and sat down again. "I can't move this safely by myself. If I pull the wrong rock, the whole mass could slide down. I've known that since the first day." She said it, and for the first time there was something almost like a smile in her voice. "I've been lying here for 7 days. I've looked at it for 7 days. I tried once and then stopped, but now someone knows where I am. Does that change anything?" "It changes everything." He took out his phone, raised it, and turned slowly in a circle. Not a single bar appeared. He'd known that would happen from the moment he'd squeezed through the narrow passage, but he tried anyway. "There's no signal in here. The closest place where I got reception was a rock outcrop to the east, almost 1.9 miles from here. I have to go back there." She was silent. "I'll send a message to the police. They'll need lifting equipment and people who know what they're doing, and they won't be able to get in here until daylight. So you have to leave me here. Yes. She didn't ask another question. She only nodded once. Rafe opened his backpack, took out the emergency blanket, unfolded it, and wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking the edges beneath her back so it wouldn't slip. He left the second bottle of water, the first aid kit, and all the food he had left. Then he unclipped the metal whistle from his backpack strap and placed it in her palm. 3 blasts if anything changes. 1 blast means I'm getting close on my way back. And if you don't come back, someone will still get here by morning, because the message will go out before I do. He stood. She caught his wrist for only a second, then let go. You don't owe me anything. No. He lifted the backpack onto his shoulders. But I've owed someone else this for 9 years. By the time he made it outside, darkness had settled completely over the mountain, and the rain had weakened into a fine mist that clung damply to his face. Rafe stopped in front of the cave entrance for about a minute. During the day, he'd found the place because of the current of cool air and the small scatter of gravel lying on top of the pine needles. But by morning, when 7 or 8 people carrying equipment would be trying to enter a mountainside where every stretch looked almost exactly like the next, a current of air wouldn't help anyone. He bent down, picked up 3 stones scattered around the base of the cliff, turned each one so its flattest side faced upward, and arranged them in a straight line directly in front of the crack, each stone spaced exactly the same distance from the next, the row pointing straight toward the opening. He did it quickly, without thinking, then stood and looked at the stones for 1 second, and he knew he'd just recreated the very thing that had led him here. He turned away and started back. The return journey felt far heavier than the way in, and it wasn't because of the slope. During daylight, he'd climbed with only a possibility in his mind. Now he was descending with a living person sitting in darkness behind him, and every step he took carried the weight of that knowledge. He switched the flashlight to its lowest setting, just bright enough to illuminate 3 steps ahead. He repeated every landmark to himself like a lesson memorized by heart. The cave entrance, the animal trail, the clearing with her 3 stones, the wall of pines, the place where the water turned sideways, the landslide. He didn't trust his memory, so whenever he reached one of those markers, he stopped for a moment and looked back the way he'd come, memorizing what it looked like from the opposite direction. When he crossed the landslide, the slope was covered in loose stone, and rocks kept shifting beneath his boots. He moved sideways instead of straight down, placing each foot carefully before shifting his weight. And somewhere near the middle of the slide, a fist-sized stone broke loose beneath his heel. He slipped half a step and caught himself on the roots of a shrub. The stone rolled downhill, struck another rock, which broke loose in turn, and the sound of falling stone continued far below him for a long time before finally disappearing. Rafe remained completely still, one hand gripping the shrub's roots, and he didn't move until the very last sound had faded into the valley. Only then did he breathe out and continue, even more slowly than before. He knew exactly what he was trading for what. Saving another 20 minutes wouldn't rescue anyone, but if he broke a leg halfway down this slope, the mountain would keep both of them, and the woman sitting inside that stone chamber would wait for a whistle that would never come. It took him more than 2 hours. The eastern outcrop was a broad slab of rock jutting beyond the edge of the forest, the only place in the entire area with an unobstructed view down into the valley, where the mountainside didn't block the signal. He climbed onto it, stood upright, and raised his phone high above his head. The screen glowed through the mist. Nothing. He turned slowly in a circle. 1 bar of signal flickered in the corner of the screen, then vanished immediately. He froze at that exact angle, arm still raised, not moving at all, and the signal bar appeared again. He opened his messages and typed with 1 hand, making it as brief as possible because he had no idea how many seconds he had. He addressed it to Deputy Sheriff Hollis Bream. Josie Callahan is alive. Western drainage basin, beyond the edge of the old slope shown on the map. Trapped beneath a rockfall inside a cave. Need technical rescue team and lifting equipment. I'll lead you in at first light. He read it once, added nothing, and pressed send. A small line appeared at the bottom of the screen. Sending. Rafe didn't lower his arm. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Mist gathered across the screen. He wiped it once with his sleeve, then lifted the phone back into exactly the same position. 5 seconds. He thought of the 7 blue ink marks on the page inside the notebook wrapped in plastic. 10 seconds. He thought of her saying that if she didn't write them down, after 2 days she'd start losing track. 15 seconds. His arm began to ache, and he still didn't lower it. Then the screen flashed once, and the small line of text changed. Sent. He remained standing there a little longer, his hand still raised, as though lowering it might somehow make the message fall back out of the air. Then he finally lowered his arm, dropped into a crouch on the rock, and for the first time in 7 days, allowed himself to release one long breath. Below him, the valley remained completely dark, without a single light. He stood, turned toward the west, and began climbing back up. At 5:41 in the morning, the sound of metal striking stone echoed in from outside. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Rafe stood immediately, went to the narrow passage, and blew one long blast on the whistle. From outside came 3 answering blasts, evenly spaced and decisive, the signal of trained professionals, not people simply searching. He went back inside. "They're here." Josie didn't say anything. She only nodded, and he saw her hand tighten around the edge of the blanket. The first person to squeeze through the rock opening was a technician wearing a helmet, with a coil of rope on his back and a flat equipment bag. He straightened inside the stone chamber, swept his light around once, then spoke toward the entrance without turning his head. "We have a patient. Conscious and responsive. Rockfall present. Bring everything in." Then he looked at Rafe. "You're the one who sent the message?" "Yes." "Those 3 marker stones outside the entrance, are they yours?" "Yes. We passed that spot 3 times before we saw the crack. Without those stones, we'd still be down there right now." The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rescuers came in one after another. No one ran. No one raised their voice. A female medic came to Josie first, sat beside her, introduced herself as Ruthie, and asked 3 very simple questions. What day of the week it was, how long Josie believed she'd been there, and whether she had pain anywhere besides her leg. Josie answered all 3, and Ruthie looked up at the team leader and said only one word: "Good." Meanwhile, 2 technicians had already crawled around the rockfall, shining lights beneath it, gently tapping each boulder with the handle of a hammer and listening to the sound that came back. They worked for nearly 20 minutes without moving a single stone. Then one of them sat back, pulled off his gloves, and turned to Rafe. "Did you touch any of this?" "No." "You didn't try to pull one of the rocks out?" "I thought about it. Then I saw that the upper boulder was resting on only 2 points." The technician looked at him for another second. "Good thing you didn't touch it. Move 1 stone in this pile and the whole thing comes down." Rafe didn't answer. He looked toward Josie, where Ruthie was wrapping another blanket around her shoulders, and thought about those 3 summers on mountainsides like this one, about the old man who had told him exactly once about fallen rock, and had never needed to say it again. He hadn't saved her by pulling harder. He'd saved her by knowing when not to touch anything. Removing the rock took nearly 3 hours. First, they installed 4 metal supports around the pile, tightening each one a little at a time, one person turning, while another kept a hand against the upper boulder to feel for vibration. Then they slid a flat air bag into the gap beneath the lowest rock and began inflating it. The bag lifted the stone very slowly, only a few inches at a time, and after every lift, the entire team stopped, waited, listened, checked the supports, then continued. No one hurried anyone else. No one said a single unnecessary word. Josie lay still and followed Ruthie's instructions. And throughout those 3 hours, she simply kept her eyes on the crack in the ceiling, where the light gradually changed from lead gray to white, then to pale gold. A little after 8:30, the team leader said quietly, "All right." 2 rescuers reached down, pulled her free, placed her on a stretcher, and secured her. She didn't make a sound. Getting the stretcher through the narrow passage was the hardest part, and took nearly another 40 minutes. They had to dismantle it, move her through, then reassemble it outside. By the time Josie was carried out through the rock opening, the sun had risen above the eastern ridge. She narrowed her eyes, turned her face away, then slowly opened them again. It had been 7 days since she'd last seen the sky. The helicopter was waiting in a clearing about 400 paces away, the only place on the entire slope wide enough for it to land. They carried the stretcher through the wall of pines, past the patch of ground where she'd arranged 3 stones on the 2nd day. And no one noticed those 3 stones except Rafe. When they reached the helicopter, Ruthie bent down and said something to Josie, then looked up for him. Josie turned her head toward Rafe. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She only looked at him for a moment, then gave him one very slight nod, the same nod she'd given him in the first-floor hallway after the night of the party. The helicopter door closed. The blades began turning faster, The grass flattened outward in a circle, and the aircraft lifted into the morning sunlight, tilted slightly, then flew east. On the mountainside, the rescue team began taking down the supports and coiling the ropes. There were no cameras. No one applauded. News that Josie Callahan had been brought down from the mountain alive reached Philadelphia before the helicopter had even landed. Trey Lindquist heard about it close to noon, and 3 hours later, he drove himself to the county police station, walked inside on his own, gave his name at the front desk, and asked to see Deputy Sheriff Hollis Bream. No one had called him. No one had come looking for him. He simply understood that the only person who could tell the entire city where that car had gone that night was now lying awake in a hospital bed, conscious, and she was going to talk. He sat in an interview room for 4 hours, told them everything, and asked for a deal. The following afternoon, Rafe called Jerry Mancuso exactly once and told him he wanted to meet at the house, in the kitchen. At 7 o'clock that evening, Jerry arrived on time, alone, just as he'd done for 40 years. He hung his coat over the back of a chair, sat down, and looked at the 3 things already arranged on the long table in front of him. The first was a folded sheet of thick paper with a jagged, torn edge. The second was a stack of printed documents stamped by the county police. The first page bearing the name Trey Lindquist. The third was a business card from the federal prosecutor's office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, with an appointment date handwritten on the back and an intake stamp from the day before. Jerry didn't pick up any of them. He only stared at the folded sheet of paper longer than the others, and Rafe saw that he recognized it immediately from the torn edge. "Where did you find it?" "I didn't. Someone gave it to me." Jerry nodded slowly. He didn't ask who. He sat quietly for a while, both hands resting on the table, and when he spoke again, his voice was still the same calm, gentle voice everyone in that house had heard for 40 years. 40 years, Raphael. Your father brought me into this house when I was 18. I know. What are you going to do to me? Rafe didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair and sat across from him, in the exact place where 11 nights earlier someone had carried out a bowl of soup and placed it in front of him. What do you think I'm going to do? I think you're going to do what your father would have done. For the first time that entire evening, he looked Rafe directly in the eyes. Go ahead. I'm sitting right here. I'm not going to run. I just don't understand why you haven't done it already. Because then I'd be the only one who knew the truth. Jerry went silent. If I did it my father's way, tomorrow morning people would say you'd disappeared, and 3 months from now there'd be 3 different stories about what happened to you, and not one of those stories would contain my sister's name. Rafe placed one hand on the folded sheet of paper. For 9 years people have said she got lost. She didn't get lost, and I'm not letting her be buried beneath another rumor. She'll be buried beneath a conviction. Jerry looked down at the business card. He was intelligent enough to understand what the intake stamp from the previous day meant. Everything lying on that table already existed in another copy somewhere else before he'd ever walked through the door. You turned over the whole file? The whole file. Your part too? My part too. Jerry looked up, and for the first time that evening, something very close to astonishment appeared on the face of the man who had sat beside 2 generations of masters for 40 years. You'll lose everything. The port, the unions, this house too. You understand that, don't you? I understand. Your father spent 30 years building it, and my father left me as a man sitting in a kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning because he can't sleep. Rafe stood, walked to the sink, poured a glass of water, and set it down in front of Jerry, exactly as one would for a guest in his own home. They've scheduled me for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you want to go with me, you can. If you want to go by yourself, that's your choice. I'm not keeping you here, and I'm not taking you there. Jerry looked at the glass of water for a long time. He didn't drink it. He stood, took his coat from the back of the chair, put it on, then carefully straightened the collar with the slow, practiced motion of a man who had done exactly that in this kitchen for 40 years. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment without turning around. That Maid. What about her? I offered her a way out. She didn't take it. Then he opened the door and walked out on his own. 3 weeks later, Josie was sitting in the 4th-floor hallway of the Children's Hospital, one crutch leaning against the wall beside her. Bertie's surgery had lasted 6 hours and had been over since morning. The doctor had come out and told her that everything had gone exactly as expected, then walked away. Josie sat there a little longer before she finally allowed herself to believe it. When Rafe arrived, He stopped at the far end of the hallway, instead of coming straight toward her. Josie pushed herself upright on the crutch, before he could step forward to help. I can stand on my own. I know. He handed her a sheet of paper. It was a confirmation of expenses, and on the line naming the paying organization was the name of a foundation she'd never heard of before. The Nadia Castellani Foundation. What's this? It's where the money from selling the house went. The whole house, the cars, everything they hadn't already taken. Someone helped me establish the foundation last month. I told you I don't accept things I don't fully understand. Now you understand. She stared at the paper for a long time. You want me to thank you, don't you? No. He looked through the glass doors into the recovery room, where a 9-year-old girl was sleeping. I want you to never have to pick up anyone's money from the floor again. The trial began that winter, and lasted a very long time. Rafe turned over everything, including the evidence that implicated himself. And he lost everything his father had spent 30 years building. The newspapers wrote extensively about the port, the unions, and the numbers. At the very end of one article, there was a single short line mentioning that the case involving the death of a 16-year-old girl in the Poconos 9 years earlier had been reopened. Very few people read far enough to see it. Rafe didn't correct anyone or explain anything. By spring, Bertie was walking normally again, and Josie no longer needed crutches. One morning, the three of them returned to the Poconos and walked along a low trail beside the lake, an easy path with no steep climbs. Bertie ran ahead, picked up a flat stone, skipped it across the surface of the water, then turned around. Can I ask you something? Yes. That day when you went looking for Josie, you went alone and nobody knew what you were doing, right? Right. Then if nobody knows what you did, does it still matter? Rafe looked out over the lake for a long time, watching the circles made by the skipping stones spread slowly across the surface before disappearing into stillness. It matters to the person who got to come home. That's enough. The mountains don't ask who is rich and who is poor, and cold rain treats a maid exactly the same way it treats the most powerful man in the city. What determines a person's fate isn't their position in life, but whether someone is willing to ask one more question after everyone else has stopped asking. Don't be too quick to believe the neatest story, because the truth is rarely convenient, and real kindness often walks quietly home without asking anyone to remember its name. If this story touched you, please leave a like so I'll know you're still here, and share it with someone you believe would never give up on you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can listen together to more heartwarming stories every day. How did today's story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who patiently kept looking for you after everyone else had turned away? Leave a comment, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, happiness, peace, and serenity every single day. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next story.